everybody, this is Dr. Vishal Trivedi from Department of Biosciences and Bioengineering, IIT Guwahati. And in the course Basics of Biology, we are going to discuss and understand the different properties of the living organisms and how you can be able to study the living organisms. So living organism could vary from a very tiny particles like viruses, or it could be a very large organism such as the dinosaurs. So whether it is virus particles or whether the dinosaurs, both of these living organisms actually share some of the similar properties, or also they have some of their exclusive properties as well. So as you can see that the coronavirus is simply a virus which is actually causing the disease, and it is also similar to some of the previously known viruses, and its mode of transmission is also the same, that it goes from the one person to another person through the coughing and other kinds of mode. And but there are exclusive properties, so that this virus is actually causing the pathology within the humans, and that pathology is causing the death of the individuals. But scientists are trying to understand the biology of this particular virus, and how they are doing it. They are actually doing the different types of experiments, then they are collecting the data, and then these data are going to be interpreted, and then they are trying to draw the conclusions from these experiments, and that's how they are coming up with the new hypotheses as well as the theories, so that you can be able to overcome the pathological outcome of these particular viruses. So as you can see that the understanding the living organisms and how a particular living organism is exhibiting its different biological activity is an easy task, considering that you will actually going to plan a systematic study. You are going to do the systematic experiments, you are going to analyze those experiments, and based on those conclusions you can be able to draw, you can be able to design the new experiments. So the purpose of this particular course is that we are trying to give you a glimpse of what is the living organisms, what are different properties of a living organisms, and how this living organism, how you can be able to study a particular living organism utilizing the different types of tools and different types of ideas what is available in the with this particular stream of science. So the first question which I would like to ask you is, so what is science and what is its objectives? So we start our lecture today with this particular questions, that what is science and what is its objectives. So science is literally means that you have the knowledge. So science literally means that you are actually having a systematic arrangement of the knowledge, and that knowledge can be interpreted, that knowledge can be utilized for the human welfares, or trying to understand the biology of that particular organisms. So these topics, which are being part of the under the big umbrella of science, are ranging from the spiritualities to very cutting edge open heart surgeries, and all these comes not by a single day, but it comes by a systematic progression, systematic analysis of the different types of experiments and the results. So because of that, the humans have decided that they will go with this kind of particular type of study, and that's how they are actually trying to understand the different aspects, whether it is something which is related to physiology or whether it is related to something else. So because of that, the science is further being divided into the two different main branches. These main branches are the social sciences and as well as the natural sciences. You know that every living organism is actually remain in the within a society, whether it is a whether it is a jungle or whether it is a city like Guwahati. The living organisms are under the continuous interaction with their neighbors, their environments, and all other kinds of things. And so because of that, the science is further being divided into two main branches. One is called as the social sciences. So social sciences is actually the science which is actually going to deal with the human behaviors and its relationship with the other humans in a society, and it is very complex in terms of the many aspects what is being covered within the social sciences. And that is actually a very very big field of science, where you can be able to study the many aspects related to the relationship of the humans with the other humans, and as well as the relationship of the humans with the other non-biological factors what is present within the society. Apart from that, you have the natural sciences. So within the natural sciences, you have the various fields which deals with the understanding the natural phenomena, and that are grouped within the natural sciences. What you see here is that the social sciences, so within the social sciences, you have the many sub branches which are being developed as the human were progressing within the society, and how they are being utilized, because as you grow and as you generate more and more knowledge, you are actually developing the you're trying to bifurcate so that you will be able to focus on a particular topic. And that's how the social sciences or the natural sciences are further being subdivided into the different fields to study a specific aspects of the particular particular branch of the science. So the social sciences, which are further being divided into the specific sub branches, these are as follows. So you have the anthropology, you have the economics, you have educations, you have geography, you have history, then you have linguistics, then you have political science, psychology, public administration, and the sociology. So these are not extensive, exhaustive list of the fields or the sub branches that are being covered within the social sciences. It is possible that you may have the some additional sub branches which are not being listed here. This is just to give you an idea that these are the different types of fields which are being evolved from a single science field, and then it is further divided into social sciences and natural sciences. And within the social sciences, you have these many different sub branches. For example, the anthropology, it is the field of science which study the past and the present of human, considering the combined knowledge feedback from the social sciences, the biology, and the human behavior. So anthropology is actually going to discuss about the human behavior within the society, and how the different types of knowledge feedback from the social sciences. Then you have the economics, this field of the science which actually understand the production, distribution, and the consumption of the wealth. Then you have the education. So this field of science is actually understand the latest tools and techniques, and it actually is going to develop the different fields, different tools, so that the learning experiences from a human could be more and more better. For example, we are conducting the MOOCs courses. So these MOOC courses, idea of the MOOC courses came from the people who were doing the study in the or research within the education field, and that's how they realized that it would be possible to go with the high end knowledge to thousands and millions and billions of students simply by if you go with the online courses. Similarly, you have the geography. So this field of the science which actually studied the several aspects of earth, including the soil type, spatial location of the rivers, mountain, and environment. So geography is actually going to help you in terms of the how the location of the different types of rivers are available. So it actually going to help with the natural resources, how you can be able to exploit the natural resources, and so on. Then you have the history, the field of science which actually study the past of the human culture and experience in different frames. So the history is very important for the social development of a human being, because the history actually tells us that what mistake you have made in the past and what experiences you have gained by doing this particular. So if you study, if you listen the the ancient stories, if you study, and then if you understand that okay, they have made this mistake by following this particular thing, then why not we should not do that, because otherwise we will also going to commit the similar kind of mistake. So that kind of new information you get by studying the history. Similarly, you have the linguistics, a field of science which actually study the human language. Then you have the political science. The political science is the field of science which the theory and practice of politics and political behaviors. So that is political science. Then you have the psychology, the field of study which study the human behavior in context to the mental processes. So psychology is also a very important field where the physicians or doctors are trying to understand what kind of changes are happening within the mental illness or within your brain or the thinking process, and because of that you are trying to develop different types of diseases. You can imagine that the people are going with the depressions and all other kinds of mental problems, and they are only they will be getting cured simply by changing their mood and changing the understanding the what is happening with the thinking process, and that's how they are being diagnosed with the particular disease, and that's how they are being cured by the doctors. Then you have the public administrations. So this field of science which study the management of the human workforce in an organization to achieve the maximum efficiency. And then you have the sociology, and that field of science which actually study the human behavior and its relation within the society. So apart from the social sciences, you also have the natural sciences. These natural sciences are as like just like as we discussed for the social sciences, the natural sciences are also being subdivided into the sub branches. These are the physical sciences, then you have the earth sciences, and then you have the life sciences. The branch within the physical sciences are actually studying the processes or which are operating within the non-living system. The two main branches fall within the physical sciences are the physics and the chemistry. Now, the earth sciences, the branch within the earth sciences study the planet Earth. The topics within these branches are the atmosphere, hydrospheres, oceans, biosphere, as well as the solid Earth. The main branches fall within the earth sciences are the ecology, then oceanography and geology and the meteorology. Meteorology is the field of science which actually going to tell you what will be the weather tomorrow, whether there will be a thunderstorm, where there will be a raining, whether there will be some hails are going to fall, and how the weather is going to be for next 1 month or couple of weeks, so that you can be able to plan your different work or other kinds of things, right? Similarly, you have the life sciences. The branch within the life sciences study the living organisms such as the plant, animals, and humans. The main branches falls within the life sciences are the geology and the botany. Many of the life sciences branches are interdisciplinary and interact with the subject to understand the better understanding of the living organisms. So the life sciences is a field of science which actually study the living organisms, this which includes the plants, animals, and humans, viruses, bacteria, algae, fungi, and all other kinds of living organisms. Whether you can be able to see them through the naked eye or not, or whether you can be able to utilize some tools to study them. So there are mainly been fall into the two different categories, the geology and the botany. So the life sciences are actually dealing with the living organisms, and life sciences are also being called as the biology. So what is mean by the biology? Biology is a field of science which are being formed, and so if you see the biology is a term which is being made by the two names, the bios and the logos, right? So what is mean by the bios? Bios is called as the living organisms, which means, and the logos means the study. So biology is a field of science which is actually going to study the living organisms. So as the definition concerned, the field of science which actually study the living organism is known as the biology, and the person who study the biology is called as the biologist. So before we getting into the detail of the biology and the different aspects what are going to be we are going to cover in this particular course, let's understand some and introduce you to some of the biologists who have actually done the remarkable work, and that because of them we could be able to reach to this stage where we can be able to do the gene manipulations, where we can be able to do the many types of molecular biology related experiments, cell biology related experiments, where we could be able to generate the test tube babies. We could be able to even generate the the artificial things and all that, right? So let's study the and realize the contribution of the some of the eminent biologists. This is not the exhaustive list. I have just taken few examples to give you an idea that how the eminent biologists have actually paved the way so that you can be able to understand the different aspects of the biology. So the biology started with the, so these are the few known biologists, where you have the Aristotle, Galen, Andrea Villiers, then you have the Marcello Marpecci, then you have William Harvey, then you have the Antony von Leeuwenhoek, and the lastly what we have is the Charles Darwin. So what you see here is the Aristotle. The Aristotle is also been called as the father of biology, because Aristotle was the first person, or in general, we will say that he was the first scientist or the biologist who realized this, that there are many different types of the the living organisms present, and that's how he has actually attempted the first time how we can be able to classify these living organisms. So so Aristotle was the Greek philosopher, right? And he actually put the first attempt how you can be able to classify the biota. What is mean by the biota is the living organisms, right? Biota includes the living organisms of the that particular uh, living organism, whether this that includes the plants or the animals, right? So he has actually utilized that information, and that's how he could be able to called as the father of the biology. Then we have the Galen. So this is the picture of the Galen, right? And he was the Greek physician, and he was the first to perform the dissection. So he could be able to utilize, he has developed the tools, and because of utilizing that tools, he could be able to perform the dissections, which means he could be able to cut the body of a particular animal, and he has shown the different types of organs what are present in that particular animals, and that's how he was called as the father of anatomy. So anatomy is the field of science which actually study the internal structures of the particular organisms, which means it is actually going to say what are the different organs are present. For example, in a human, we have the heart, the liver, the lungs, the pancreas, the all different types of organs, and these different types of organs have the different contribution in terms of the different aspects of the physiology. Then we have the Andreas Villiers. So this is the Andreas Villiers, and he made the first dissection on the human anatomy, which means he has actually done the anatomy of the human beings, and that's how he could understand the what are different organs are present in the humans. And he discovered the comparative anatomy, which means he actually discovered what are the different types of organs are present in humans compared to the other animals. Then we have the Marcello Malpighi. So he was an Italian physician and the anatomist, and he was actually the founder of microscopic anatomy, which means he could be able to do the dissections visualizing the microscopic tools. Then we have the William Harvey. So William Harvey is also been considered as the father of cardiology, and he showed that conclusively that the heart actually is the organ which actually pumps the blood, and the blood actually circulates within the human body. And he has done the similar type of several types of experiment utilizing the tools and techniques whatever available at that point, and then that's how he actually concluded that the heart is the main organ which is responsible for pumping the blood within the human body, and this is the blood which actually circulates within the human body. Then we have Antony von Leeuwenhoek. So Antony von Leeuwenhoek is famous because he has discovered the microscopes, and utilizing his microscope, which was very crude and the very simple microscope, he could be able to discover the microorganisms, so which is also he termed as the animalcules, which means animal-like creatures, but they are very very small. Because in the, remember that in the ancient times, the people were understanding that the animal means big, which means cat is an animal, but the lower organisms are not animals. Like algae is not an animal, or those kind of things, right? So those things are being broken down. That those kind of theory was broken down by the Antony von Leeuwenhoek, because he utilizing the, the microscope, he could be able to see the microorganism under the microscopes, and that's how he has discovered the protozoans. And these animals are these particles, whatever they were, living organism, moving living tiny living organisms, are being considered as the animalcules. Then finally we have the Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin is actually famous. So this is the Charles Darwin, right? And this is the Antony von Leeuwenhoek. So the Charles Darwin actually did the several types of experiments with the, the very extensive expeditions to the around the world actually, and that's how he actually drawn the conclusion that the evolution of the particular organism is happening because of the selection by the natural means, which means he was a big advocated, or he was a big philosopher of, or he was actually favoring the idea that the whatever is modifications are happening within a particular living organism, that is because the living organism is being forced for going through those kind of modifications, because he want to adjust themselves towards the the changed natural conditions. And he has he has he has utilized the different types of models. He has he has taken the pigeons from the different parts of the world. He compared them, that how the pigeons are, what are their feeding habits and all that, and all these results are being presented into the a book which is called as the Origin of Species. So when the Charles Darwin has written the book like Origin of Species, that year and the following years, the Origin of Species was the best seller books. Even the number of copies what are being sold by the, are sold by the of the Origin of Species are more than the number of copies of the Bible on that particular year. So people were buying more and trying, and they were, they were very curious about understanding the evolutions, how the humans are being evolved, or how the other organisms are being evolved, what is the theory behind that, and so on. And that's how the Charles Darwin was a very 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 influential person, trying to govern the evolution theories and so on, right? So this is all about the contribution of the few of the known biologists. As I said, these are not the extensive list. This is just a simple example of showing you the different scientists and their contributions. So as the name suggests, right, the biology is a field of science which actually study the two aspects of the biology. One is the bios, and the other one is logos, right? So as the name suggests, the definition of the biology is that it is actually going to study the living organisms. So if you want to study a living organism could fall under the two categories. Either it could be the study of the plants, or it could be the study of the animals. So if you fall under the plants, then you are actually going to use the subdivision which is called as the botany. Or if it is under the animals, then you can actually be able to utilize the geology. Now, before we get into these particular fields and try to understand the properties of these particular living organisms, we have to ask the questions: what is mean by the living organism? What defines a particular object as a living organisms? Because until you don't define that, how you can be able to say that, or how you can be able to study that particular living organism? Can we say virus is a living organism? Can we say mobile is a living organism? Can we say something like that? So what parameters we should use to define that, okay, this is a living organism and this is not a living organism? So let's understand that by comparing the two models. One where we have taken a model of the diesel engine, and I have compared the properties of a diesel engine with a living organism such as the flowering plants. So, what defines the living organisms? So, I have given you a comparison of the different properties. So, if it is a living organism, so these are the different features what we can actually be able to, use. So, here you have a living system. So, we know that the plants are living system. And then I have taken a non-living system. So, we know that the diesel engine is a non-living system. So, I have taken a diesel engine. So what will be the source of energy in terms of, as far as the source of energy is concerned, the living systems are actually going to be depend on to the food, right? So for example, in the case of plants, they are actually going to use the food from the sun, whereas in the case of the other organisms, they are actually going to use they are going to use the plant as a food or as a source of energy. Whereas in the case of the diesel engine, it is actually going to use the diesel engine as a diesel as the food energy source. Then you have the machinery. So what kind of machinery is present? So machinery is made up of the different types of metabolic reactions. If you don't understand any of these terminologies, you will be able to follow you once you follow this course, you will be able to understand these terminologies. So metabolic reactions, so it actually going to utilize that particular food, then it will put it into the different types of metabolic reactions. These metabolic reactions are actually going to generate the energy, and that energy is going to be utilized by the that particular organisms. Whereas in the case of diesel engine, it is actually going to be the combustion, which means the diesel is going to go into the engine, and that is actually go through a process of combustion. So combustion is a process which actually is going to burn the diesel, and that's how you are actually going to generate the energy. What will be the mechanism of utilizing the energy? So utilization of the produced energy, what you are going to generate within these metabolic reactions, are going to be the anabolic reactions, which means this energy is going to utilize for the anabolic reactions, so that you can be able to utilize that for driving the biological activities. Whereas in this case, it is actually going to be a torque which is going to be generated by the combustions, right? What will be the disposal waste material? So because when you do the anabolic reactions, or the catabolic reactions, you are actually going to generate the waste material, right? So in both the cases, it is actually going to generate the waste material. So the waste material is going to be present in the case of biological system. It is going to be a biodegradable waste material, whereas in the case of the diesel engine, it is actually going to exhaust in the form of smoke. So you see, I have compared the two systems. One is living system, the other is a non-living system. And as far as the features are concerned, both of these systems have the similar features, right? So our question is still remain the same. What defines a living object, right? So considering the properties of a living organisms, people have come up with the different features which are definitely should be present in a living organism. Let's see what are these features. The number of characteristics are being observed in a living organism, and it can be defined as, so one of the first system what is also should be very important is that the living organism should have the self growth, and it should also have the self renewal. What is mean by the self growth is that it should be a intrinsic growth rather than the extrinsic growth. For example, if you take the dust particles, right? If you take a small dust particle, it may also grow, right? It may grow by taking the another dust particle, right? And that's how it will actually grow all over the place, right? And that's how initially you have taken this dust particle, but now it becomes this big dust particle. But this is a extrinsic growth. You are actually adding the dust from outside. Whereas in the case of living organisms, you are only going to provide the food and that food is actually going to get converted into the energy, and that's how this living organism will actually grow in terms of the size, in terms of the other kinds of parameters. Similarly, you have to have a self renewal, which means the living organism should be able to produce the replica of their same copies, which means the living organism, if you start with the one living organism, it should be able to get broken into, and it will give you the two living organisms. This is going to be the, again, as I said, it is going to be a intrinsic, it will be coming out of this particular thing. Whereas in the case of the non-living systems, you probably have to provide some kind of external forces. Because of that, the dust particle might be get broken down and may give you the multiple copies, but that will not going to be self renewal. It require the additional forces from outside. You might have to use a hammer, and then you might have to broken a bigger stone particle, and that's how it is actually going to give you the tiny stone particles. But that is not considered to be a self renewal. It is considered to be that you are providing a force from outside. Then it should also have the endogenous ability to produce the energy, which means it should have its own self sufficient machinery so that it could be able to produce the energy on its own. Which means, if you say, for example, if you take a plant, you just have to do what you have to do, right? If you have a plant, what you have to do is you have to just provide the sunlight, right? And that's how the plant is actually be able to going to produce the food. So that is called as the endogenous ability to produce the energy. You cannot have the non-living organism to be performing these tasks, because they require the exogenous energy source. For example, just we compare the living organism versus the diesel engine, and it is shown, right, that the diesel engine required a diesel from outside. So you have to pour the diesel. Whereas in this case, it is actually going to keep running the metabolic reactions, and that's how it is actually going to be able to produce the foods. Then the living organism could also be have the movements, right? It could be able to move from one place to another place. Definitely, we have the exceptions, right? So for example, we have an exception in the case of plant because they don't move. Right? There are plants which also moves along the water streams, but the majority of the plants actually are stick to a particular place in the soil, and that's how they don't move. But that does not mean that the plants are not living organism. Plants are definitely be a living organism because they actually follow some of these properties. And then they also should have the ability to self-replicate, which means the living organism should be able to produce the more copies of the similar kind. Now, if you see that these properties or these parameters, so these parameters were actually being, considered when the people have not discovered some of the, because there were no technological development. So because of that, the people have not discovered a non-living system such as the robot, right? So you might have seen the robot, and you might have seen the robots in the movies also. So robots are very much possible and very much could be able to perform some of these tasks, and because of that, the people have started rethinking and redefining their parameters and their criterias, how we can be able to define the living organism. For example, the robots are could be able to utilize and reassemble the new robots, and that's how they can be able to have the ability to not the self replicate from the endogenous, but if you provide them the raw material, they could be able to produce more robots, right? Similarly, they can be able to reduce the energy, because if you put the solar panels into the robots, they could be able to generate their own energy, and they don't be dependent on the externally provided energy, which means they don't require any kind of diesel or electrical energies. Similarly, the robots, they can actually, so that's a, because the people have started developing some of these complicated non-living organisms or non-living systems, the people have come up with another additional criteria what will be defined the living organisms. So in addition, with the advancement in the technology, the criteria for the living organism is redefined. These redefined criteria are as follows. What is the redefined criteria? First criteria is that the living organism should have the complex organizations, which means it should be composed of the different types of cells, which is not possible in the robots. Robots are only made up of the different types of electronic components. So complex organization, which means the living organism should be composed of the different types of cells. Right? So you can have the cells for the heart cells, you can have the liver cell, you can have the lung cells, you can have spleen cells, like that. Then it should be having a metabolism, which means it should be able to have to produce the energy and utilize and perform, which so it should be able to provide the energy and utilize the preformed food material, which means it should have the metabolic reaction so that you can be able to produce the energy and it can be able to utilize the preformed food material, which means if it provides the food material from the plant, it can be able to utilize that. It should be responsive, so it should be able to respond to the extreme environmental conditions such as the temperature, wind, and starvation. So this is very very important, which means the it should be sensitive for the external factors. It should be sensitive. See, you see the robots. Robots are not sensitive, right? Even if you send the robots to the moon where the temperature is going to be extremely cold, they don't, it doesn't matter to them because they will be still be able to work, they will be able to perform their task, whereas the humans are actually going to be susceptible for these kind of conditions. Or even if you send the robots to a very very hot conditions, then also it is going to work. So that's how so responsiveness is a very very important criteria for a living organism. You might have seen, right, if you have the you might have seen the moving ants in your home, right? As soon as you touch the with the hands, they actually change their their direction, and they just move away, right? Similarly, you might have seen the many other things, right? Then you also have the another criteria which is called as the growth. So growth should be endogenous growth. It should not be the exogenous growth. I have given you an example of the dust particle versus the other living organisms. So dust particle are actually going to have the exogenous growth, right? It will capture the other more dust particle, but then it is actually going to grow because of the exogenous growth, right? Whereas in the living organism, you are going to have the endogenous growth. Similarly, it should have the reproduction, so it should have the ability to give off the springs. So this is a very very important criteria for a living organism. It should be able to reproduce. It should be able to pass on its genetic material to the offsprings, and that's how it can be able to continue with the within the world, right? And then it should have also have the ability to evolve, which means it should have to have the ability to better and better to keep it updated within the system, right? You might have seen, right, or you might have heard that the humans are being evolved from the monkey, right? And you might have seen the monkeys, right? They are very very different from the humans. So in a millions years, people have started changing their food habits, their ability to learn, and that's how they are actually being very very diverged from the monkeys. So that is a very very important thing, that if you change environmental conditions, if you change some kind of hurdles, you will be actually be able to change accordingly so that you will be able to overcome these problems. And that is very very important for a living organism, because you can imagine that if you could not be able to change the because of the change environmental conditions, then it will you will not be able to succeed, right? Then you will be get dead, right? Because if suppose there will be a scarcity of water, right? And if there is a plant which cannot adopt to these particular type of low water conditions, then that plant is going to die, and that's how it is actually will not be able to propagate, it will not be able to give the offsprings, and that's how it that particular species is going to be vanished. So the adaptation to the new change or the adaptation to the new environmental condition is very very important phenomena of the living organisms. So these are the things what defines the living objects, and these are the things we are going to study within this particular type of course actually. So let's understand some of these properties. So diversity and complexity in the biological system. So diversity and the complexity in the biological system is a very, very important thing, which actually is very, very, which makes the biology very interesting, right? You might have, you see these are the different types of flowers. These are the different types of flowers are present in the northeast part of the India, right? Like Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, and all those states. So these, and you see that so much variety of the flowers are present, and that's how there is a diversity and the complexity in the biological system. That complexity and the diversity is in terms of the different types of organisms, different types of organisms, and different shapes. So let's see what are different types of complexity is present in the biological system, so that you will understand that studying these particular type of organism is not a easy task. So complexity in terms of, so as per the rough estimate, a total species present on the planet Earth are 8.7 million. These species are widely distributed both on the terrestrial Earth and inside the oceans. So you see the number of species what are present on the planet Earth is 8.7 million, and these are distributed on the all the three parts. Like they will be present in the water, right? So they will be present in the oceans, they will be present on the earth, and they are also present in the airs, right? So within the air you have the birds, within the earth you have all the terrestrial animals like dog, cat, buffaloes, elephants, and within the water you are actually going to have the fishes. So you have the different types of fishes and so on. So you see here is the total number of earth. So you have majorly you have the two different categories. You have the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes. Don't worry about these terminologies because this is just an introductory class. So I am just giving you so we are going to define all these terminologies in the subsequent lectures. So eukaryotes, you can within the eukaryotes you can have the animals, you can have the chorusmetas, you can have the fungi, you can have the plantae. So you see the different types of species what are present onto the surface or what is present within the oceans, and you see the distributions within the animals, chorusmeta, fungi or plantae. They are distributed thoroughly from on the both the locations. Similarly, you have the prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are the lower organisms, and they are also being thoroughly distributed within the terrestrial animals or the oceans. What I am not have not considered is the viruses because or even other smaller organisms. So what I have taken is only the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes. Now, what is the diversity? Diversity is in the term of in terms of shapes. The shape of the different organisms present varied a lot. Within the prokaryotes, bacteria of different shapes such as the bacilli, cocci, etc. In eukaryotes, the plants are found with different shapes. Right? You might have seen the plants which are of very very tiny, like a few millimeter plants, or you might have seen the trees, right? Very very big trees, right? Then you have the shape of the different organism varies from very tiny virus particles to a giant blue whales. If you go to any, this is very important, right? So if you go to any zoo, right, within India, right, you will see that zoo is actually having a museum, right, where you are actually going to see that they are actually going to put all these living organism on a display with a scale, right? And if you see the scale, you will see that how the blue whale is almost like 30 to 35 times bigger than the humans. So there, if you see, you will understand, and then you will be able to appreciate that how the how the different biological organisms are being actually varied in terms of size. Then you have the spatial distributions. So living organisms are distributed from the extreme cold weather, right? You might have seen that the polar bears, which are present in a very very extreme cold conditions, to very hot region of the planet. They are also distributed on land, water, and in the air. So we have already discussed, right? On the land, you have the lions, you have the buffaloes, you have the dog and cat. In the water, you have the different types of fishes like shark, dolphins, and ornamental fishes. And in the air, you may have the different types of birds like. Then in that, apart from that, the complexity also comes when they are talking about the biological activity. So due to the wide distribution of the species to the extreme conditions, the species have devised the metabolic reactions to adopt these conditions, and because of that, the biological activities are also going to be different, right? For example, the polar bear, if it has to survive in that extreme cold conditions, it has to run its metabolic reaction in such a way so that it should actually be able to keep its body warm, right? Similarly, you might have seen the fishes which are also being present in the lake, but the lake is completely frozen, right? You might have seen the dull every year. I think we when there's a winter, people show the video of the Dal Jheel, right? And that is very famous in every year. I think the news reporters are actually showing the news of the Dal Jheel got frozen, right? That does not mean that the organism what are present in that particular lake is going to be die, right? Because if there is a frozen thing, right? So what they do is they have adopted, they are actually going through the different types of biological, they have adopted the biological activity in such a way that they could be able to survive even in that extreme cold condition or even the frozen conditions. So this is all where the you have to appreciate and understand that the biology or the living organisms are very complex. They are actually complex in terms of the diversity, and they are also complex in terms of their diversity. And because of that, it is easy to understand them if you understand the relationship between the different organisms, but it is also difficult in terms of that you cannot understand some of the unknown factors which might be governing that particular type of phenomena. So, in this particular course, we are actually going to understand the living organisms. So, if you want to understand the living organisms, you have to understand the many aspects of the living organisms. As I said, the living organisms are very complex in terms of the shape, in terms of the size, in terms of the spatial distribution, or in terms of the biological activity. And that's how, because they are so much diversified, it is impossible for a particular scientist to study all these 8.7 million species organism to be studied individually. And that's how you might have to categorize these animals. So because of that, you might have to use the different types of organisms or different types of criteria. For example, first thing what you have to do is you have to classify these organisms so that you can be able to understand the relationship between the different organisms. So if you classify them, the 8.7 million could actually be categorized into 5 to 6 different bigger groups. So if you study one group, you can be able to study the, for example, 1 million animals or species, right? So if you can classify them and if you group them, then you can just pick up one organism from the each group and you can just study that in detail, and that is actually going to be a representative animal. For example, if I want to study the for example the fishes, right? So I can just take the one fish, right? And I can just study all the different properties of that particular fish, and that is actually more or less going to group for all the fishes what is present in that particular water, right? Once you study that, you can also study the evolution, right? Because evolution is actually going to give you the relationship between these 8.7 million species of the or living organisms. Once you understand the evolutions, then you can actually understand the different types of cells, right? As I said, the living organisms are complex in nature, so they are actually be able to made up of different types of cells. So if you understand the cells, if you understand different types of cells, then you can be able to understand how this particular organism is made up of, and you know that the cells are made up of the biomolecules, right? The cells are made up of the different types of biomolecules, and these biomolecules, you can, if you study the biomolecules, you can be able to understand how these cells are made up of, what are the different types of metabolic reactions are happening, how these biomolecules are being utilized in the different types of metabolic reactions, and how these biomolecules are playing crucial roles. Similarly to that, the biomolecules, if you can also study, if once you understand the properties of these biomolecules, you can be able to understand the cellular processes. And once you understand the cellular processes, you can be able to summarize these cellular processes, and then that's actually is going to tell you about the physiology of that particular organism. Because ultimately you want to understand the physiology of that particular organism, and what are, because for example, how we move, right, how we run from one place to another place, or how the plants are actually synthesizing the food. These things, if you want to understand, you have to first understand the cells, right, where the plants are actually performing these reactions. Then you have to understand the biomolecules, like the enzymes and all other kinds of proteins, lipids, which are participating in these reactions. And then you have to understand the cellular processes, and when you integrate all these informations, you can be able to understand the physiology. You can be able to understand how the stomata are opening within the uh, plants, right? And that's how they are actually taking the oxygen, how we are breathing, right? So if you say that breathing is a process, that breathing process you cannot understand until you understand the morphology of the lungs, until you understand the morphology of the ribs, until you understand the many such things, right? Until you don't understand the whole passage of the breathing process. So with this, I would like to conclude our lecture here. In a subsequent lecture, we are going to discuss each of these aspects individually. And with this, we would like to integrate the whole stories or whole picture, so that you will be able to understand the living organism in a better way. We also going to discuss what will be the advantage of understanding the living organism, because what will be the advantage, that also we are going to discuss. So with this, I would like to conclude my lecture here. Thank you.